All right, so now we're moving on to section 2.4, and this is going to be broken up into 2 days. So the first ones that we're going to do is a Pareto charts and a time series graphs, and we're going to do these two on videos. So that's what you're going to do tonight for homework, and then pie graphs we're going to do in class together. All right, so remember, as we're going through all of these videos, all these sections, these are questions that you should be asking yourselves. How can we present data better? How do we know what graph to use, and how are different graphs more useful than others? All right, something that we should constantly be thinking about as we're going through and solving these problems. All right, now the first one that we're going to go through is the Pareto chart. That's what this video is going to be about. All right, and the Pareto chart is when we want to display qualitative or categorical data. So when we're doing qualitative or categorical, we're going to do a Pareto chart, and you're going to see a Pareto chart looks like a histogram in that it is a bar graph, but the difference is a histogram is when we are using quantitative data, and Pareto chart or Pareto graph is when we're going to be using qualitative or categorical. All right, so let's go through this problem. All right, so here we can say we filled out a frequency distribution in which we're talking about the average cost per mile for passenger vehicles on a state turnpike. All right, so because here we are referring to states, this is going to be qualitative data or categorical, because the states here that we have, Indiana, Oklahoma, Florida, Maine, Pennsylvania, they can't necessarily be ranked by the best state. They are not numerical value, but they are states. So this is going to be considered to be categorical data or qualitative, right? So that's how we know that we will have to use a Pareto chart. Now, the first thing that you need to do when you're doing a Pareto chart is when you're creating this, here this number, this sense, is our frequency. It's how often something occurs, or in this case, how much each state is. What we need to do is first we need to rearrange this table by our largest frequency to our smallest, or in this case, by the greatest sense to the smallest sense. So this is what our table should look like. Instead of it going just 2.9 cents to 4.3, 6.0, etc., it should go from greatest to least. So Florida should be first in our table because they are the most cents per passenger, then Pennsylvania, then Oklahoma, then Maine, then Indiana. So the first thing you want to do is you want to rearrange your table either based on our frequency from greatest to lowest, or in this part, from our most cents to our least cents for how much it costs per passenger. All right, so just like before when we're doing, because I said the Pareto chart is going to be very similar to our histogram and that we're using a bar graph, we want to create an X and a Y axis. So here's our Y axis, here's our X axis. Our y-axis will be our frequency if we're dealing with frequency, or in this case, since we're dealing with a cost per mile, it will then be our cost. And then our x-axis is going to be whatever data we are talking about. So in this case, it's the different states. So it's Florida, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, Maine, Indiana, so it's the different states. All right, so it's very similar to our histogram in the sense that we're going to draw bar graphs. And remember, just like before, we can't have any spaces in our bar graphs. And before we were labeling our x-axis with our class boundaries. Here we don't have any class boundaries that we can label. But the one thing you want to make sure is that you are, each bar is the same width. You want to try and make them as close to the same width as you possibly can. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and fill in our bar graph. So for Florida, it's our first one. It's at 6 cents. So this will be up against our y-axis. And then here we will say that this is Florida. All right, so I'm just going to color this in red real quick. And then this we will say is Florida. So we can go ahead and we can write it. Let me go ahead and let me rewrite this in now. All right, I'm running out of room, but you can write it diagonally like I did here, and you can just write it up. So there's Florida. Now the next one that we'll do is going to be Pennsylvania. So it's 5.8 cents. So here, remember, we want to try and keep them as close to the same width as possible. So there's our Pennsylvania. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill in the rest of these graphs. All right, so this is what your final graph will look like. Remember, you try to keep each of your bar graphs the same width. There's no space in between, and we just went in and filled in the rest. So we had 4.3 cents, 3.8 cents, and 2.9 cents. Now, when you are looking at your Pareto chart, you make comparisons by looking at the height of the bars. So here we know that we stacked the greatest to the least. So we can go ahead and talk about Indiana being the lowest. We can also say Indiana is about half as much as Florida. We can make any comparison we want, but we're looking at the height of the bars, and that's what it is that we're determining what we want to talk about. Because we know that the height is representing our frequency, or in this case, it's representing the cost for each of the states. All right, so that is what you need to do for a pair 2 chart. Just to go over it again quickly, you're going to create your frequency distribution, where this will typically be your frequency. In this case, it was just talking about how much or the cost per passenger. And then you will go ahead and create your X and Y axis like we did with our histogram, where Y is still going to be our frequency, or in this case, it was different because it was our cost. And then our X is, in this case, our states. And then we're just going to draw our bar graphs depending on how much our frequency is or how much they are. And then remember, we go from the greatest to the least. And that's it for this video. And we'll go through any questions that you have, and we'll go through some examples in class.